Through her historical novels and the series based on them, Philippa Gregory has profoundly shaped the popular perception of figures from the Wars of the Roses and the Tudor era. The Starz series, The White Queen and The White Princess, have been particularly influential in this regard. For many, the York brothers are now vividly associated with the portrayals in these series, and the story of the Princes in the Tower serves as a crucial link between them. For my channel's 1,000 subscriber special, I decided that a professional examination of how these events are portrayed would be worthwhile. The princes are undeniably one of the main reasons many subscribers follow my content. When I reached this milestone, I put the topic to a vote, and the majority supported it. Since then, my channel has surpassed 2,000 subscribers. Thank you so much for your continued support and the incredible affection you've shown. Before diving into the analysis, I'd like to clarify a few points about my approach. First, this channel will not become a React channel. React-style content is something I reserve exclusively for special occasions. Second, copyright considerations limit what I can show. I will primarily use images and only include 2 very brief video clips. Third, costumes are not my focus. This area is not one of my strengths, so I won't be discussing them. Fourth, I will avoid the portrayal of witchcraft in The White Queen. This element will not be part of the analysis. To ensure all viewers are on the same page, I'll begin with a brief introduction to the content of the shows, with particular attention to the princes. Following that, I'll discuss what I enjoyed about the series and why. Then, I'll focus on the elements that inspired the suffer-through part of this video's title, examining scenes that I found particularly challenging. Finally, I'll address 2 topics about which I feel neutral: the portrayals of Perkin Warbeck and Richard III. By neutral, I mean that I believe the strengths and weaknesses of these representations balance each other out. I fully acknowledge that these are works of historical fiction. Philippa Gregory's goal was to craft compelling stories, not to adhere strictly to historical accuracy. It is, in fact, a testament to her skill that her depictions are so convincing that many take them at face value. This, however, makes it all the more worthwhile to approach the narrative critically from a historical perspective. Let me emphasize that this is not a critique of Gregory herself. I will only express criticism when her personal historical interpretations not only serve the story, but also seem intended to influence perceptions beyond the realm of fiction. My analysis will focus primarily on her justification of Margaret Beaufort's possible involvement in the murder of the princes. Now, on to the plot. At this point, a clear spoiler warning is necessary for both shows. Essentially, The White Queen and The White Princess function as 2 consecutive seasons of the same series, even though the entire cast changes. Despite this, the storylines are directly connected and continue seamlessly. The first season, The White Queen, centers on Elizabeth Woodville, portrayed by Rebecca Ferguson, while the second season, The White Princess, focuses on Elizabeth of York, played by Jodie Comer. Across both seasons, I believe the performances by the actors are exceptional. Any criticisms I raise pertain solely to the writing, not the acting. The White Queen spans the timeline from Elizabeth Woodville's first meeting with Edward IV to Henry VII's victory at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485. The fate of the princes in the Tower takes center stage in the final 3 episodes. These episodes explore the death of Edward IV, the rise of Edward V under Richard III's guardianship, the Woodville family's sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, the disappearance of the princes, the Buckingham Rebellion, and the climactic Battle of Bosworth. While Episode 9 is titled The Princes in the Tower, the boy's fate is treated as a secondary plot, or B plot. The main storyline, the A plot, focuses on the political dynamics among Richard III, Margaret Beaufort, and Elizabeth Woodville. In this version of events, the series suggests that Elizabeth Woodville attempts to smuggle her younger son, Richard, out of the country by swapping him with a servant. Edward V eventually realizes the truth when his brother is brought to him and plays along with the deception. Meanwhile, the series depicts a romantic subplot between Richard III and his niece, Elizabeth of York, after she emerges from sanctuary. While I understand the dramatic purpose of including this storyline, I'm relieved it doesn't impact the fate of the princes, so I won't delve into this particular nonsense further. The White Princess picks up exactly where the first season ends, with the Woodville family anxiously awaiting news from the Battle of Bosworth. When they learn of Henry VII's victory, they attempt to hide Edward Plantagenet, the son of George, Duke of Clarence, but their efforts fail. The family moves to a manor where Elizabeth of York must marry Henry VII as previously agreed upon by their mothers. Before the wedding, however, Margaret Beaufort subjects Elizabeth and her son to a fertility test, an anachronism, as such tests didn't exist at the time. The series takes further creative liberties by depicting Cecily Neville fleeing to Burgundy to seek refuge with Margaret of York, an event that never occurred historically. The first half of the season focuses on the growing relationship between Henry and Elizabeth and the rebellion surrounding Lambert Simnel. Simnel is portrayed as impersonating Edward Plantagenet, which leads to the real Edward being imprisoned in the Tower of London for the rest of his life, a grim fate that did, unfortunately, happen in reality. The second half of the season shifts its focus to Perkin Warbeck, with the series deciding that he is, in fact, Richard of York. In the final episodes, Elizabeth of York confesses to Warbeck that she knows his true identity. However, she resolves to ensure his execution to protect her new family. In a twist, Elizabeth secretly substitutes Warbeck with a criminal, allowing Warbeck a private beheading in the Tower, while the imposter is hanged publicly. Let's begin with the positive aspects of the criticism. My personal favorite character from both seasons is Thomas Stanley in The White Queen. This character, about whom we surprisingly know very little, feels remarkably three-dimensional. His verbal sparring with his wife, Margaret Beaufort, is exceptionally well written. Although Margaret pulls numerous strings, Stanley never appears dependent on her. Instead, he stands out as a political player in his own right. Another success is the depiction of Edward IV's illness and how suddenly it arises in the series. Historical sources indicate that his illness came as a surprise to many. Initially dismissed as minor, it quickly became more serious, and the series portrays this escalation in a convincing way. In connection with Edward, I also appreciated the portrayal of Jane Shore. The series shows events largely through the perspectives of Elizabeth Woodville, Margaret Beaufort, and Anne Neville, but Jane seems to emerge from nowhere. There's no drawn-out love story between her and Edward. Her presence simply grows over time. The depiction of her penitential walk, which is mentioned in historical sources, is also well done. While there is debate about whether it occurred as dramatically as shown, the portrayal is rooted in historical evidence, which adds to its credibility. I found all the scenes involving Henry and Jasper Tudor during their exile to be particularly successful. The father-son dynamic between these two men is well portrayed, capturing the depth of their relationship. The depiction of Henry's invading army is similarly effective, a ragtag group of criminals who brought an epidemic to England. The series conveys the sense, well supported by historical sources, that Henry's forces were woefully inadequate. Another strong point is the portrayal of Robert Brackenbury. He is shown as a man deeply loyal to Richard III, but also guided by his own firm moral code. Richard rewards him for his service, but when Anne Neville asks him to get rid of the princes, he outright refuses. This portrayal is, in my view, a compelling variation of the account given by Thomas More, in which Richard himself commands Brackenbury to murder the princes, and Brackenbury declines. Finally, on the positive side, I appreciated that the princes themselves were treated as a subplot. We know so little about them, and what we do know is often superficial or derived from sources we cannot fully trust. By not making them central characters, Edward is the only one with a speaking role, the series preserves the air of mystery surrounding them. Now, let us turn to the elements that were less successful. The first example highlights one of my biggest criticisms. In the series, Richard is shown at Edward IV's deathbed. In reality, he was in the north at the time. While I understand the creative desire to give the two brothers a final farewell, Richard's absence was a pivotal factor in how events unfolded. The Woodvilles exploited his absence to avoid naming him Lord Protector and to declare Edward V of age prematurely. It was the panicked letters from the capital that prompted Richard to act. He aligned himself with Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, portrayed in the series by Rory Williams, Arthur Darvill. Before setting out, Richard had sworn allegiance to the new king in the north and secured the loyalty of the northern region to Edward V as well. The sequence of events following Edward IV's death loses much of its coherence if the critical detail of Richard's absence and the sense of betrayal it must have engendered is omitted. If Richard had been present and was officially appointed regent by his brother in front of witnesses, there would have been no need for the subsequent maneuvering. He could have confronted the conflict directly in the capital. However, the series opts to disregard this idea because it requires Richard to be at Stony Stratford for dramatic purposes and because history said so. This scene brings me to my next point of criticism: the events at Stony Stratford, with one caveat. I believe the portrayal of Edward V is handled quite well here. What we see aligns closely with the description provided by Dominic Mancini. Unfortunately, the rest of the depiction falls short. In the series, there is no feint where Richard and Buckingham first enjoy a boozy evening with Anthony Earl Rivers. Instead, the show opts for a bloody fight, which, as far as we know, never happened. Historically, Richard and Buckingham's men disarmed the Woodville troops and quietly took their leaders into custody. These crucial details are ignored in favor of a more dramatic confrontation. This portrayal seems to reflect how favorably Philippa Gregory views Richard III. It's a challenge to present him as a hero in this specific scenario. Historically, Richard lied about his reasons for being there and then acted ruthlessly. However, none of this is shown in the series. Instead, Richard appears as a peacemaker, completely lacking the urgency and determination of the real Richard, a man politically marginalized in his absence and forced to act decisively to reclaim his position. Both Ricardians and Richard's accusers agree on one point: Buckingham was a villain. Unfortunately, the series doesn't even attempt to add depth to his character. What was so masterfully achieved with Thomas Stanley, who also doesn't have a particularly favorable reputation among Ricardians, is completely absent when it comes to Buckingham. Despite the numerous promotional images for the series, it always seems to rely on just one stock portrayal of Buckingham. His humanity is only hinted at in fleeting moments. His annoyance with the bad weather during his rebellion and his fear of execution. The possibility that his rebellion could have been motivated by conscience isn't explored at all. The series also glosses over the extensive preparation his rebellion would have required and the close coordination with the Woodvilles, which are significant aspects of historical context. Instead, Buckingham's role seems reduced to being a figure for collective hatred, a missed opportunity for a more nuanced portrayal. The next scene I'd like to critique is the execution of Rivers, Grey, and Vaughan. There are several aspects of the depiction that I appreciated. The series effectively conveys that these were not official executions, but political murders. Although Richard and Anne were not actually present at these executions, I thought the decision to show them there made sense. Their presence underscores that these men die because Richard wills it. However, the series incorrectly states that the executions occurred on the Tower grounds. In reality, Edward V's companions were imprisoned at Pontefract Castle and executed there. This location placed the events firmly within Richard's northern sphere of influence, far from London. The executions certainly did not happen in front of the princes. The series also muddles historical events by blending the execution of Rivers, Grey, and Vaughan with the execution of William Hastings, which did take place on Tower grounds. It's possible that Edward V witnessed Hastings' execution, but his younger brother likely did not, as he was still in church asylum at the time. The next scene never fails to make me laugh because of its depiction. I even have a clip for this one. The princes have disappeared, and Richard is shown frantically searching the tower, calling out for the boys. Within the logic of the series, Richard has intercepted Edward, taken his crown, imprisoned him, and executed his close confidants right in front of him. Yet somehow Edward is still expected to trust his uncle enough to come out of hiding when Richard calls for him. While it's understandable that filming couldn't take place in the actual Tower of London, the portrayal of the setting is laughably poor. Based on the proportions, the scene can only be set in the White Tower, but its layout was, and still is, completely different. Furthermore, the tower complex is much larger in reality. Richard would have had to search through 20 other towers and various houses, not just a single space. I understand that the scene is meant to dramatize Richard's innocence in the disappearance of the princes, but it comes across as absurd. At best, it unintentionally highlights a valid critique often made against Richard, that he was, at the very least, a terribly inept protector. Now let's turn to the White Princess, where the series provides a complete resolution to the mystery. Margaret Beaufort is depicted as ordering an attack on the tower, ostensibly to free the princes. However, she secretly instructs her husbands to kill and dispose of the boys. Margaret later confesses to these actions, which forces her to murder her brother-in-law Jasper and results in her being disowned by Henry. None of this, of course, actually happened. It is widely documented that Henry and Margaret shared a respectful relationship. There is no record of even a single significant dispute between them, let alone one escalating to such extremes. The notion that Margaret would kill Jasper is nonsensical, both historically and from the perspective of the show's own narrative logic. If Jasper had known of her actions, he would have informed Henry, leading to the same resolution the show ultimately delivers. The theory that Margaret Beaufort orchestrated the princes' murders is largely an invention of Philippa Gregory. It traces its origins to the 17th century writings of Sir George Buck and William Cornwallis. Buck's account, however, was significantly altered by a relative to make it more dramatic, with witchcraft absurdly suggested as the murder weapon. Needless to say, Margaret Beaufort did not kill the princes using witchcraft. Margaret resurfaced as a possible suspect in some Ricardian writings between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For example, Sir Clements Markham wrestled with whether to accuse Henry or Margaret. However, it was Gregory who popularized a fully fleshed-out theory as late as 2014, where she wrote, "She certainly had a motive. If the York boys were dead, then her son would be the next heir, from the Lancaster side of the family." Placed in London with a superb spy network and men loyal to her, she was probably able to do so. And it is significant that though she and her son blackened the reputation of Richard III, they never actually accused him of murdering the boys. The problem is that none of this is true. Margaret's son Henry was not next in line for the throne after the princes. If the princes disappeared before the titulus regius was issued, then Richard III's own son was next in line. If they disappeared afterward, the princes had already been excluded from succession. Furthermore, the de la Pole family had a stronger claim than Henry. Henry justified his claim to the crown solely through the right of conquest. The idea that Margaret had spies and enough loyal men to orchestrate the prince's murders is also baseless. Following the Buckingham Rebellion, she was under house arrest, closely monitored by her husband. While she could write letters to her son, Richard's own spies intercepted her communications. Richard even allowed these letters to continue to maintain an informational advantage. The Tower of London, along with its custodian Robert Brackenbury, was firmly under Richard's control. If Margaret had possessed the means to assassinate the princes, she would almost certainly have targeted Richard directly instead. Additionally, it is incorrect to claim that Margaret never directly accused Richard of the murders. The official stance of Henry's government was that Richard was responsible for the princes' deaths, and Margaret, as a member of this government, upheld this position. There was no need for her to repeat it explicitly over and over again. And let's address Gregory's reasoning. Which of the arguments she attributes to Margaret doesn't also apply to Richard III, and to a much greater extent? He had a clear motive. He usurped Edward V's crown and aimed to solidify his rule. He had the opportunity. As king, he held absolute authority. And just like Margaret, Richard never directly accused himself of murder. In my experience, those who accuse Margaret of killing the princes are often staunch Ricardians. They tend to be particularly aggressive in asserting her guilt. Here's my theory. Many Ricardians regard Margaret as a murderer because her efforts led to the death of Richard III. Of course, Richard wasn't murdered. He fell in heroic combat on the battlefield. Yet the frustration over his death seems to be redirected toward Margaret, casting her as guilty of the crime for which, in their view, Richard was wrongfully accused. Had Margaret orchestrated the princes' deaths, she would have risked undermining her ultimate goal, the marriage between Henry and Elizabeth of York. Such an act would have severely endangered the alliance with the Woodvilles, which was vital for Henry's support. While I doubt this explanation will convince those determined to see Margaret as the culprit, one fact remains indisputable. Richard III catastrophically failed as protector of the princes. This failure is why theories suggesting that the boys were secretly removed from the tower remain more widely accepted. This brings us to Warbeck. The series reveals early on that he is the real Richard of York by showing how the boys are deceived. Personally, I would have preferred if this revelation had been withheld, leaving viewers in the dark as they were in real life. Such ambiguity would have added far more dramatic tension. One aspect of Warbeck's portrayal that I appreciated was his charisma. Historical sources vividly describe his ability to win people over and persuade them, and this quality is well captured in the series. However, it's unfortunate that his relationships with Maximilian I and James IV of Scotland were not explored more deeply. Both men were crucial to his campaign, but they are treated as mere footnotes in The White Princess. A significant argument for Warbeck's authenticity is that he is said to have strongly resembled his father, both in appearance and stature. In this regard, the casting of Patrick Gibson might not have been ideal, as he is noticeably shorter than Max Irons, who portrayed Edward IV in The White Queen. The series takes creative liberties with Warbeck's interactions, particularly with Elizabeth of York. They share many scenes, yet no historical evidence suggests they ever met. Moreover, the series implies that Elizabeth had a child of Warbeck's, possibly with Catherine Gordon, killed. This is pure invention, as Catherine Gordon became a trusted confidant of Elizabeth in real life. These changes sacrifice historical accuracy for the sake of drama. I also found the decision to depict Elizabeth setting fire to the royal palace to help Warbeck escape highly problematic. While there are theories suggesting Warbeck may have been lured into a trap during an escape attempt to justify his execution, I find these theories unconvincing. Regardless, such theories point to the opposite of Elizabeth organizing a rescue. On the positive side, I appreciated the depiction of Warbeck's relationship with Edward Plantagenet. In reality, the two men did form a bond and conspired to escape together. However, in the series, Edward is portrayed as being so mentally impaired by his imprisonment that he was incapable of attempting an escape. This deviation simplifies a tragic and complex historical relationship. While there was much to admire in the Warbeck plotline, several opportunities were missed. The dramatic execution scene in the deserted tower, for instance, was incoherent. Historical accounts confirm that people witnessed Edward Plantagenet's execution and could testify to it, making the series' portrayal feel implausible. Overall, the Warbeck storyline offered moments of strength, but also sacrificed historical depth for narrative expediency. Let us conclude with the man whose name will forever be inextricably linked to the princes, Richard III. I believe it's only fair to offer a special compliment to Aneurin Barnard. He truly brought this role to life, creating a Richard who won many hearts. From a historical perspective, it's also fitting that a young actor was chosen for this part. Yes, I read the comments under my videos about his age. Additionally, it was refreshing that Richard's scoliosis was never made an issue. On the surface, Gregory seems to have made an effort to present a non-idealized Richard. We see him reaching for the throne, sending people to their deaths, and for a time, fearing that he himself had the princes killed by accident. It's also a positive choice that none of the more fantastical theories, such as Richard sending the boys out of the country, were included, as the historical foundation for such a plot would have been too flimsy. Richard's infidelity with his niece also doesn't paint him in the best light, further complicating his portrayal. Nevertheless, Richard still feels strongly idealized in this version. For a long time I couldn't explain this impression, but I eventually realized that any negative portrayal of Richard seems to be a fabrication. He did not have an affair with his niece, he didn't have executions carried out in front of his nephews, and there is no indication that he didn't know what happened to the princes. At most, we can say he never addressed the topic. All of the negative scenes in the series are clearly designed to serve the dramaturgy. I don't want to say that they lose their impact as a result. The series certainly shows Richard's violent side, but in my opinion, it makes much more of an effort to justify these actions than it does with other characters. Almost every negative action attributed to him is shown to be influenced by external forces. The evil Richard rarely acts on his own, unlike the good Richard who searches the tower for his missing nephews. I'm not bothered by the fact that the series chose not to portray Richard as a murderer. What concerns me more is the tragic heroic figure he seems to have become, a character clearly designed in contrast to the Richard invented by Shakespeare. I do believe this portrayal is the best we've seen on screen to date, particularly with respect to historical accuracy. But there's still room for improvement.
And finally, in my own voice, thank you so much for my wonderful first full year on YouTube. I look forward to seeing you again in January, and I wish all my viewers a very happy new year. And as always, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.